Have you ever had to walk away from a toxic family member? No names, just yes or no.
Are you ready for a shocking truth? Do you know your true worth? Because on Christmas morning, I found out exactly where I stood in my family, and instead of screaming, I chose to let the silence do the work. It started in that familiar way where my mom likes to put on a little show. She gave this speech about how family is about sacrifice, and how some people need a little more help than others, and then, with this big smile, she handed my sister Paige a set of keys. She said, "You deserve this more." Everyone clapped, Paige squealed, and I sat there thinking back to all the times I was told there was nothing left when I asked for something as basic as help with tuition or help after I got slammed with hospital bills from a car accident. I did not cry, I did not argue, I did not even flinch. I just sat with this strange calm in my chest because I already knew what was coming. My dad was sitting next to me, and he slid this plain envelope into his lap. I had given it to him right after the keys were handed over. He thought it was going to be a thank you card or maybe some family photo I had printed for him, because that is the kind of daughter I have been: quiet, considerate, always smoothing things over. But when he opened it and read what was inside, I watched his smile evaporate in real time. The letter was short and not dramatic, but it hit him hard. It requested a full accounting of the trust fund that my grandmother had left for both Paige and me. It included bank records that I had quietly pulled with the help of a lawyer, showing transfers from that trust directly into the escrow account for Paige's condo. And stapled to the back was a notice of representation, my lawyer's letterhead making it official that from this day forward I was not handling this as a family, but as a beneficiary with legal rights. You have to understand, my grandmother Eleanor was very clear before she passed. She wanted things to be fair, equal, no excuses. She said it over and over again. Equal means equal. She was old school in the best way. Your word mattered. Your promises counted. And when I saw those transfers that drained the account without my knowledge or consent, I knew exactly what she would have wanted me to do. So I did not make a scene when Paige waved those keys around like she had just won the lottery. I did not argue when my mom tried to spin it as Paige needs stability, and we all know she has struggled. I let them talk, and then I let that envelope do the talking for me. Because I had already taken the first step before I even walked into that house. I had filed a temporary freeze notice with the escrow company. Utilities could not be activated. The HOA paperwork was stuck in limbo. Paige might be holding those shiny keys, but the door she thought she was about to walk through was already locked from the inside. When my dad read the words "unauthorized transfer of principal" and "beneficiary consent required," he went pale. He tried to laugh it off at first, to say this was just some misunderstanding, but he could not keep it up. My mom looked over at me with that practiced expression she uses whenever she feels cornered, the one that says, "We will fix it later, just don't embarrass us now." But this time, I did not give her the usual out. I leaned forward and said, quietly but firmly, I wanted us all to be clear going into the new year. If this condo was purchased clean, then there is nothing to worry about. If it wasn't, then we need to stop pretending. That line landed like a rock in a glass of water. Paige froze. My mom tried to jump in with another speech about family sacrifices, and my dad finally asked me, in this voice that was almost shaking, "What exactly did you send besides this?" I looked him straight in the eye and said, "Enough." And then I let the silence stretch, because the truth is, I had sent more than just a letter. I had already put the bank, the escrow company, and the HOA on notice that funds from a disputed trust were involved. Nothing was moving forward until this was resolved. It was the first time in my entire life that I did not just swallow the unfairness, did not just tell myself that someday it would even out. I set the line down in black and white, and for the first time, they were the ones left scrambling, not me. And that was only the beginning. When I woke up the next morning, after the house had finally gone quiet and the dishes were stacked and the last relative had left with a to-go container and a knowing look, I lay there and realized that the knot in my chest I had carried for years was not fear or guilt or even anger. It was the weight of all the small edits I had made to my own story to make everyone else comfortable. The careful trimming of my needs around Paige's emergencies and my mother's speeches and my father's silence. And I decided that if we were finally going to do this without costumes or props, then we would do it in daylight with names, dates, amounts, and signatures that actually meant what they said. People love to talk about family lore as if it is scripture, and ours had a favorite verse about how Paige was always one break away from getting it right while I was the steady one who did not need much, and every time a new almost arrived, an apartment she could not quite keep, a boutique idea that sounded charming over wine but never survived a ledger, an engagement party that needed a venue deposit right now or it would ruin the memory. The money and attention flowed to her like a reflex. While I learned to pay my own bills, negotiate my own overtime, and smile through holidays where I would be told there was simply nothing left this season, but we would make it up later, and later, like a mirage, never arrived. My grandmother's passing should have been the moment that reset everything because she had been the only person who could cut through my mother's performance and my father's avoidance with a look and a sentence, and before she died, she called both of us to her kitchen and said, in that calm way she had when she wanted something to land, that the trust was her way of making sure neither of us ever had to beg for basics, that equal meant equal, not we will balance it out at some undefined time. And that if anyone tried to twist that into a story about who deserved more, then we would know they were not protecting family, they were protecting their own control. I carried that sentence like a spare key for years. And when I finally called the bank to ask a simple procedural question, and the numbers I heard did not line up with the stories I had been given, I understood that this was not about jealousy or resentment. It was about fidelity to the one person who had always told the truth. Without flinching. So when I invited a few relatives and two of my parents' closest friends to stop by for dessert the night of Christmas, framed, as always, as a low-key gathering with coffee and pie and a lot of polite conversation, I was not staging a public ambush. I was staging a reality check in the only language that still works when a family's myth has outgrown the facts, and I placed my grandmother's handwritten note in a small frame on the mantel where the holiday cards usually go, not centered like a trophy, but present like a mirror, and I let everyone settle before my mother began her favorite monologue about how hard it is to raise two different children and how sometimes love means reallocating resources to the one who needs it most, which is a poetic way to describe siphoning from a trust with two beneficiaries while telling one of them to be a good sport. I did not interrupt her, because interruptions only feed drama, and I am done being cast as the unforgiving one, so I waited until Aunt Denise, who has always had a quiet allergy to nonsense, asked without heat and without accusation whether the trust Carol managed allowed unequal distributions without written consent from both daughters, and when my mother said something about flexibility and intent and how Grandma Eleanor trusted her judgment, I pressed play on a tiny recording taken years ago at that same kitchen table where my grandmother's voice, steady and unmistakable, said that the entire point of the trust was to keep both sisters standing on the same floor. That emergencies would happen, but equalization would be immediate and documented, and that no one, not even a well-meaning parent, should ever move principle without transparency because secrets rot families faster than debt. The room changed in that quiet way where people stop pretending they are at a party and start doing math in their heads, and I watched my father's eyes close for a long second because he knew the numbers from the envelope were not random screenshots. They were the clean edges of a trail that could be followed by anyone with a calendar and a highlighter, and before my mother could pivot to a story about hurtful timing, I said, as evenly as I could, that a full accounting request had already been delivered, that the title company had been notified there was a dispute attached to the condo purchase, and that if everything turned out to be clean then we would all breathe and move on, but if it was not, then the fix would be by the book. Not by another promise that would evaporate once the decorations came down. Paige finally spoke, and she did not yell, which surprised me, but she said I was trying to ruin the first good thing she had had in years, that I could not stand to see her happy, and that our grandmother would have wanted the family to help her catch up after so many rough patches. I told her I believed in fresh starts and I believed in help, but I also believed in receipts. And if the condo had been funded fairly, then my actions would prove that, and she could enjoy it without a cloud. Yet if my name had been forged on anything, or if consent had been fabricated, then the cloud was not mine, it was theirs, and I was simply pointing at it so we could stop pretending it was a blue sky. I could feel the room holding its breath, because nobody wants to pick sides at Christmas, but nobody wants to clap while someone gets pushed off the equal floor and told to feel grateful about the landing either. And I decided to give everyone the simplest possible assignment, so I said that in the morning I would email a packet with dates, amounts, and a short explanation in plain English of what the trust required and what had actually happened. That no one needed to argue with me in group texts or call me with speeches, and that the only replies I would accept would be documents, not feelings, because feelings had been used as a substitute for fairness for long enough. Then, because revenge in my family has always looked like someone trying to bait me into a scene so they can frame me as the problem, I took the opposite route and did something clean. Before dessert was served, I walked the two family friends, who also happened to sit on the church housing committee my mother loves to mention, to the mantel and let them read the framed note. Then I told them I planned to make a small donation in my grandmother's name to a local housing nonprofit I volunteer with. Not as a dig, but as a reminder of what same floor actually means when it is not a slogan, and I watched them nod because they understood that I was not hurling accusations. I was drawing a boundary with a ruler and a level. On my way out, my father caught up to me at the door and asked, in a voice that made me stop because I could hear the decent man he still is under the habit of keeping peace at any cost, what exactly I was sending in the morning besides the packet, and whether there was anything he needed to prepare for. I told him the truth, which is that there would be one more notice he should expect, and that even though I was not trying to embarrass him, I was done protecting decisions that had never protected me. And when he asked what notice I meant, I said that the county would soon see a simple filing that would make sure no one could flip or refinance the condo while we sorted this out, that it was a practical step and not a threat, and that if everything was clean it would fall away like it was never there, but if it was not, then it would hold. And the way his shoulders dropped told me he understood exactly how serious this had become. Tomorrow morning, I said, you will get my email, and I need you to actually read every word before you try to talk me out of what cannot be talked away, and he nodded. But he also looked behind me toward the living room where my mother was smiling at guests like nothing had shifted, and my sister was already making plans out loud. And I realized that whatever happened next would depend on whether he chose truth over harmony for the first time in years, which is why, when I closed the door and got into my car, I let myself breathe for a long minute, because I had just set something in motion that would not be stopped by speeches or decorations or the new year, and I knew that by the time the sun set again, someone would put a folder in my hands that would either fix this or blow it wide open. By the time morning edged into a day that everyone else would call a holiday lull, the kind of quiet hours when people coast on leftovers and denial, my phone was already busy doing the unglamorous work of pushing facts into places where charm and tradition usually do the driving, because the email I had scheduled overnight went out to my parents, to Paige, and to the people who would have to care whether a condo title was clean, and in that email I laid out a simple roadmap written in plain English that even someone determined not to understand could follow, starting with the trust clause about equal beneficiaries, continuing through the bank statements that showed transfers labeled as bridge help and emergency support that somehow kept arriving for the same person year after year, and ending with the escrow deposit that matched those withdrawals like puzzle pieces cut by the same machine. I had learned from hard experience that arguments spoken in living rooms get retold as attitude or tone, so I had stripped the attitude out of my packet and left only the bones, dates, amounts, the pages that were missing when my mother sent her selective printouts, and a short explanation from Amrita that translated the legal steps into the kind of instructions you get on a clear appliance manual. Because I wanted no one to be able to say they did not understand what was being asked, namely a full accounting, a pause on anything that required those disputed funds to keep moving, and a choice: either prove this purchase did not touch the trust, or unwind what never should have been done without consent. Predictably, before 9, my mother replied with a long message about family reputations and timing, and how I was humiliating them in front of people who had always supported us. And I did not engage because there is no counterargument to a performance that was rehearsed over years of being rewarded. So instead, I forwarded her a short and neutral notice from the title company confirming receipt of a dispute letter and a compliance check that would hold utilities, HOA onboarding, and any secondary paperwork until the source of funds was verified, and I watched the read receipts come in like tiny blinking lights that told me, better than any conversation, that for once we were not going to hash this out over coffee and promises. We were going to hash it out with the same systems that would have protected me if anyone had bothered to use them before the keys were wrapped. The first surprise arrived early in the afternoon when my dad texted that he needed to see me, not to argue on my mother's behalf or to ask me to soften the edges, but because he had something I needed to hold in my hands. And when he showed up at my door with a manila folder that looked ordinary enough to be nothing, he stood there for a second like he wanted me to give him permission to hand it over, and then he placed it on my table and said, in a voice that did not try to sell me on anything, that he had not read half of what he had signed this year, and that if there was a chance to fix what could still be fixed, he wanted to start before the whole mess was carved into stone. Inside the folder was a stack of documents that belonged together only because their destination was the same. And at the center of that stack was a consent form with my name printed in a font I would never use and a signature that was close enough to mine to fool a casual glance, but not close enough to fool anyone who had seen me sign a lease or a tax return. And as my eyes tracked the notary stamp in the corner, my stomach did that sinking thing that is not fear but recognition, because the name under the stamp belonged to a notary who worked at a real estate office owned by one of my mother's oldest friends, and suddenly all the vague lines about flexibility and intent snapped into a shape that even the kindest relative could not pretend to admire. I asked my father how this paper came to be, and he said he did not bring this to me to rewrite what happened. He brought it because he had been asked to sign several things in a rush, had been told that my consent was on file, and had not asked to see it because he wanted the house to be happy and the holiday to be smooth, which in our family is code for letting my mother run the board and hoping no one notices the cost until January. I told him that if he was ready to say that out loud, not to me but to someone who could put it on a timeline, then there was a path that did not require the world to explode, and he nodded, because in a way he looked relieved to be told what to do for once. I sent Amrita a photo of the forged consent and the notary stamp, and she answered with the kind of measured calm that always feels like a full-body exhale, saying we would add this to the petition to compel an accounting, that we would file a lease pendens. She always says the Latin and then the translation, to cloud the title so no one could sell, refinance, or transfer the condo until the dispute was resolved, and that we would also request the notary's log to establish whether anyone pretending to be me had shown up with identification or whether the form had been stamped as a courtesy, because either way the outcome would be the same. The purchase would be treated as contaminated by misapplied trust funds, and the corrective actions would be taken whether my mother felt embarrassed or not. When the lease pendens went on record, one clean filing, no courtroom theatrics, just a line that told the world to slow down, I sat at my kitchen table and realized my revenge looked nothing like what Paige had accused me of. Because I was not chasing punishment for the thrill of it, I was chasing a reset button that would move us all back to the floor my grandmother promised. And while my mother sent me texts that combined guilt with indignation, and Paige left me a voicemail full of tired lines about jealousy and sisters are supposed to root for each other, I wrote one reply that said I would accept any proof that the condo had been funded without touching the trust, and if they could provide that proof, the notice would be lifted immediately. But if they could not, then equalization would happen the way it should have happened in the first place, with documents and signatures that actually belonged to the people who were supposed to sign. Late that evening, as the sky finally went dark and the neighborhood settled into that post-holiday quiet where only the truth has enough weight to make a sound, my doorbell rang again, and my father stood there without the folder this time. Just his keys in his hand and a look that told me he had already had the conversation I had asked him to have, and when he stepped inside he said he had found another form tucked behind a stack of closing disclosures, a second so-called consent with my middle initial wrong and the date mismatched to a day when I was out of state for work. which meant we were not only dealing with a single bad decision, we were dealing with a pattern. And as he placed that sheet on the table, he said the words I needed to hear if we were going to get anywhere honest, which were simply that he was ready to admit he had looked away because it was easier, and that he would not look away again. When the new year slid into motion and people around me were busy making resolutions about gyms, diets, and schedules they would abandon within a month, I was dealing with a very different kind of resolution. The kind that had nothing to do with promises to the self and everything to do with promises to the truth, because once the lease pendens was on record and the forged consents were no longer just suspicions, but documented facts, the story my family had been spinning for years could no longer float on charm, guilt, or the tired refrain that Paige just needs a little more help right now, and I realized that the real battlefield was no longer money, it was reputation. The very currency my mother had hoarded and spent more aggressively than any dollar amount in the trust. My mother, Carol, had built her identity around being the dependable church volunteer, the woman who organized committee events, and the person neighbors trusted to chair fundraisers, and so much of her confidence came from being seen as generous, balanced, and wise, which is why she could not stomach the thought of that image being punctured by something as mundane and ugly as misapplied trust funds or forged signatures, and instead of admitting error, she doubled down, telling friends that I was bitter, that I had always resented Paige, and that I was trying to destroy family unity out of jealousy, which might have worked if there had not been paper trails with notary stamps and bank records that spoke louder than her polished anecdotes. I decided that if she was going to fight with reputation as her chosen weapon, then I would not battle her with gossip, because gossip can be dismissed as spin, but with transparency. Because transparency cuts through the fog and leaves no safe corner to retreat to, and so I made a choice that some relatives found shocking. I quietly delivered packets, sealed and tidy, to two people who mattered to her image more than anyone else: the chair of the church housing committee and the director of the neighborhood charity board she bragged about serving on, and inside each packet I included the core trust clause, the framed handwritten note from my grandmother, the photo of the forged consent with the wrong middle initial, and a short letter in my own words saying that I was not asking for sides to be taken or loyalties to be severed, only for the rules we pretended to follow as a family to be respected as rules that counted, because ignoring them made a mockery not just of the trust but of the very values my mother claimed to live by. When my mother found out, she left me a furious voicemail saying I had no right to humiliate her in front of the community, that family matters should stay inside the house, and that I was burning bridges I could never rebuild. But what she could not admit was that the bridges had been set on fire the moment she took Eleanor's trust and turned it into her personal bank for Paige's endless, fresh starts. And all I had done was make sure the smoke was visible to the people she wanted to impress. People who now understood that her speeches about fairness and sacrifice had been delivered while she was signing off on forgery. Meanwhile, Paige, who had always thrived on being the center of emotional gravity, tried to rally sympathy by telling anyone who would listen that I was obsessed with paperwork and would rather see her homeless than happy. But her problem was that the condo HOA had an owner-occupancy clause and a strict transfer restriction, which meant she could not even threaten to flip the place or hand it to a friend to dodge the dispute. And when she discovered that her utilities had not been activated because of the freeze, she left me a message dripping with rage, saying that I had no idea how cruel it was to block her from moving in, to which I replied with one sentence: if the condo was clean, you would already be living there. I was tired of being accused of cruelty for pointing out the obvious, so I decided to reclaim the narrative in the only way that could not be spun into bitterness. I put my grandmother's words to work in public without attaching them to this family feud. By making a donation to a local housing nonprofit, I had volunteered at for years, and I named it Eleanor's Floor, a simple phrase that carried more weight than any speech because everyone in my circle knew my grandmother and knew she had repeated those words like a mantra, and when the nonprofit announced the fund and quoted her line, "Make sure both of you stand on the same floor," I did not need to explain who the both had been, because the community connected the dots. And the power my mother had always held by controlling the story began to fracture in silence. The call that sealed the shift came not from my mother but from the church board chair, who phoned her directly and told her, in the kind of calm tone that feels heavier than anger, that she needed to resolve the trust issue before it escalated further. That transparency was better than whispers, and that every day she delayed, she made it harder for people to believe her image of fairness. When my mother called me afterward, her voice was tight with controlled fury as she said, "You do not understand what you are doing," but I did understand. I understood perfectly well that I had flipped the script, that instead of me being the one expected to carry shame quietly, she was the one being asked by her own peers to explain how a trust built on equality had ended in forgery and favoritism. I sent her one text back, not a paragraph, not a defense, just a single sentence, "I do." It was the first time in years that she did not reply, and the silence was louder than any argument, because for the first time she was the one cornered by reality while I was the one holding the simple, unflinching truth. And I knew then that the final step was coming, the step where all of us would be forced to sit at a table not to talk about feelings or intentions, but to sign papers that would reset the floor for good, and I was ready. Because the one thing my grandmother taught me better than anyone was that when you stop flinching, people who have built their power on your silence finally start to shake. The day we sat at Amrita's conference table did not feel like a showdown because there were no raised voices or slammed doors, just a kind of quiet gravity that made everyone's posture a little straighter, and as I laid 3 identical folders on the polished wood, one for my mother, one for my father, one for Paige, I understood that what we were about to do was not vengeance in the hot, messy sense people love to whisper about, but a slow, clean correction that would pin the story to the page. So it could not shapeshift the moment anyone got uncomfortable, and I felt myself relax in a way I had not in years because the floor beneath me finally felt level. Inside each folder sat the same simple spine, the trust clause with my grandmother's handwriting reproduced beneath it like a signature of intent, the bank trail into the condo escrow with dates that matched the withdrawals from Eleanor's account to the dollar. The photo of the forged consent where my middle initial was wrong because people who rush always miss a detail. The notary's log that showed no identification for me on the day the document supposedly crossed her desk, and a short affidavit in which the notary, no longer interested in being a shield for anyone's embarrassment, admitted that a friend of my mother's had brought the form by. A phrase so casual it would have been funny if it had not been the hinge on which the whole theft turned. When my father opened his folder, he did not try to soften or sell anything. He simply said that he had not read half of what he had signed, and he was ready to correct that, and for the first time in a long stretch of holidays I believed him because he was not performing shame, he was choosing responsibility. Amrita outlined the path the way good professionals do when they want no one to get lost. Within 30 days a full accounting of the trust. Within that same period an equalization of distributions so that every dollar advanced to Paige without my consent would be balanced by a transfer to me from trust assets or from my parents personally if the trust had been drained. And immediately upon signatures a corrective deed recorded against the condo that would hold a half interest in the name of the trust for my benefit until the accounting closed, which meant that Paige could remain in the unit if she signed a simple repayment schedule back to the trust so that both sisters would stand on the same floor by math rather than myth. And in parallel Carol would step down as trustee in favor of a neutral professional who would administer what remained with the kind of dull, reliable fairness that never makes a good story, but always saves a family from itself. My mother tried one last pivot, the kind that had worked on me when I was younger and needed her approval more than I needed air, and she asked whether I really wanted to put my sister through a repayment plan when Paige had finally found a foothold, and whether I understood how cold it looked to bring affidavits and filings into what should have been a private healing. I told her that if the condo had been funded cleanly, there would be nothing to repay and no filings to speak of, that the only reason we were here was because she had chosen secrecy over equality and forgery over conversation, and that the plan in front of her was not punishment but repair. since it offered Paige the dignity of staying in her home while restoring the promise Eleanor made to both of us. And as I said it, I felt a sharp grief, because I realized how many years I had lost to trying to earn a fairness I had already been given on paper. Paige stared at the repayment schedule, which was clear and manageable rather than punitive, and asked whether signing meant I would control where she lived or how she decorated or who she invited over, which told me she was still seeing this as a dominance play rather than a boundary. So I said that I did not want her space or her choices. I wanted the numbers to be honest and the record to be clean so that neither of us had to pretend at holidays anymore. And that once the accounting was done and the equalization recorded, I would ask Amrita to release any interest I held in the deed, because I did not want to own half her kitchen. I wanted to own my piece. And the only way to do that was to set up a system where my mother could not tilt the board again when she felt sentimental or scared. Before anyone could try to stall, I placed one more document on the table, a sealed affidavit already lodged with the county recorder's office that would automatically become public if any attempt was made to transfer, refinance, or encumber the condo without satisfying the equalization terms, and I explained that it was not a threat but a tripwire designed to remove temptation, because we all knew how quickly a plan could unravel when a friend with a workaround appeared, and I watched my mother register the fact that there would be no quiet pivot, no last-minute signature in a back office, no escape hatch through charm or pressure, only the steps in front of us with dates, signatures, and consequences that matched the choices. My father reached for the pen first, not to play the hero but to end the decades-long habit of letting my mother write the script while he played the agreeable audience, and when his name dried on the settlement agreement and the trustee resignation, something in the room shifted, because the person who had always held the power through performance was no longer the person setting the pace, and for a long beat my mother sat very still, as if stillness could rewind the morning. Then she signed the resignation, then the settlement, then the corrective deed, and finally the apology acknowledgement that said, in plain language, that equal means equal was not a slogan but a rule. And when she pushed the papers back toward Amrita, her face was set in a way that told me she would rewrite this in her head later, but the documents would not care, because paper has no interest in feelings. Paige signed the repayment schedule last, and when she looked up at me her expression held something I had not seen since we were young and sharing a room. An uneasy respect mixed with the first understanding that boundaries can be a form of love if they keep everyone honest, so I told her what I had decided before I ever walked into the room, which was that once the equalization posted and the trustee confirmed the trust was balanced, I would release any claim tied to her unit, because I did not want my life stapled to her address, and she exhaled in a way that made me believe she finally heard the difference between control and closure. When we stood to leave, my mother said, not quite under her breath but not loud enough to play to an audience, that I had no idea what it cost her to sign. And I said that I knew exactly what it cost because I had been paying installments on that bill since I was old enough to say it is fine when it was not, and that I was done paying interest on a debt I never owed. And then I thanked my father for choosing the truth when it might still change something rather than when it was only a confession, and I walked out into a day that felt ordinary in the best possible way because nothing dramatic had happened, and yet everything had, since the family myth had been retired and replaced by a record that could not be charmed into forgetting. On the way home I stopped by the little office where the nonprofit had printed the Eleanor's Floor placard, and I ran my finger over my grandmother's line and realized that my victory was not the deed or the dollars or the signatures. It was the quiet knowledge that I had finally refused to narrate my own erasure, that I had turned the lights on without burning the house down, and that when the holidays came around next time there would be no performance I had to sit through with a smile. Only a table where we could choose to show up as people who meant what they signed, because in the end I did not win by being louder or meaner. I won by being exact, and that was enough.